Her feet found the cold like an accusation. Snow stuck to the soles of her shoes and then tore away, leaving skin raw against the pavement. Breath came out in white ribbons that fogged the street lamps. Manhattan at midnight was a hard, indifferent city, bright in the wrong places, quiet in the alleys that showed no mercy. Maya ran until her lungs burned and the world narrowed to the rhythm of one foot in front of the other. She had run so often in the last week, between hospitals, pawn shops, and a father who drank his debts away, that the motion felt like a skill learned by rote. Tonight it was survival. Tonight the one word that exploded in her head was sail. Sold. The plan had been spoken in the cramped kitchen of a queen's apartment, the radiator hissing like an accomplice. Her father, voice thin with something like shame and something like calculation. Her brother, careful and rehearsed. They did not call it selling. They called it a settlement. They mentioned a number, an avalanche of numbers, a debt that had grown too heavy, and a name, Victor Hale. Her brother had laughed like a man comfortable with the language of trade. "He'll take the girl," Brandon had said, as if discussing a car. "Wipe it clean. Take Whitmore's name, make it messy, make it loud. No one will guess it's tied back." Maya heard every syllable in a slow, private kind of horror, her life reduced to currency. The bargain had an address attached. The type of people who would make deals like that kept lists, clean and white and carefully anonymized, and a method. Nothing intricate, but enough to send a chill under her skin. They planned to use Daniel Whitmore's name as leverage. Her own people would ruin a stranger to pay their debt. She had left before anyone could notice. She left the apartment in socks, clutching a scarf, and a sense of disbelief so loud it steadied her. She should have gone to the police then. She knew that, logically, as she knew the temperature outside. But police meant forms and mistrust, and explanations her father and brother could turn into 1,000 small denials. She needed something faster, someone who could not be bought with a whisper. His townhouse was 2 blocks off the park, a slice of old money clinging to a newer skyline. It sat like an argument with the city around it. Polished stone, a door with an iron grill, a brass knocker that had been kissed by weather and time. She had dusted portraits in that parlor once, when she had cleaned for a charity gala. She had slavishly arranged pillows for an afternoon tea that had seemed like a different life. Her hand hit the wood hard enough to sting. "Please," she said when the door opened. He was not a picture of a man in crisis. Daniel Whitmore was the kind of controlled presence that made other people feel like weather. Even in his slippers and a well-cut sweater, he was a plan in human form. He looked at her, then at the smear of snow on her coat, the braid frozen with salt. She collapsed against the threshold, the story tumbling from her without rhythm. Words didn't want to be shaped. They escaped like water from a broken pipe. Her face burned, her lip split. She tasted iron and old coffee. "They're selling me," she said. "My father, Brandon, he called a man. Victor Hale, they'll—" She swallowed, and the name came out smaller. "They want to use you." He stepped back the way someone steps away from an impossible object. For a second, the apartment's hush held them like a glass dome. Outside, the city kept breathing, but inside, the two of them were pinned to the logic of what she'd said. Daniel closed the door behind her and looked at her as if cataloguing evidence rather than reacting. He moved with the same economy he used in boardrooms and hospitals when deciding what to do. Fewer gestures, controlled breath. He led her to the parlor. The heating there made the air thick with citrus and the faint, clean scent of old books. She wanted to apologize. She wanted to climb back into the street and pretend the whole night had been a mistake. Instead, she told him everything. Her father's debts, Brandon's face when he mentioned Hale, the number that had been the point of exchange. She told him about the plan to make him the bargaining chip, about the men who would not care about the truth of his wealth or his morals, only the leverage his name offered. She told him about the van, about how small-town men were already practicing the language of their lie on his name. He listened. He did not look surprised. Not because he knew everything, he did not. Because his life had trained him to treat the unexpected like a problem with edges to be fitted together. When she finished, she sat back and cradled a trembling hand. Daniel's voice was the kind you noticed at once, because it belonged to someone who understood the value of separate tones. There was a clarity in it now, not cold, but without the rush of pity. "You did the right thing by coming here," he said. "Tell me where they talked." Maya gave him the address. She told him the schedule she had learned. Thursday nights when her father drank himself talkative, the day her brother collected money for someone who would take the risk. She told him about faces she had seen in photographs and how one of them had smiled like someone who had never owed anyone anything. By the time she stopped talking, the room had darkened to shadows, and the smell of her fear mixed with citrus. Daniel's phone lay on the table like a small, lethal device. He dialed. There was an urgency that did not raise his voice. He spoke to a number and waited, listening with his mouth set in a hard line. When he hung up, he turned to her. "No one else knows yet," he said. "Stay here. Mrs. Jenkins will be up in 5. Marcus will be here in 10. Don't go outside." Maya wanted to ask what would happen if they couldn't stop it. She wanted to know if her father would ever unchoose this. She wanted, with a kind of childish hope, to undo the last 2 days and make everything ordinary again. Instead, she nodded, because speaking would make her tremble. She let herself be led to a sofa that smelled faintly of cedar. "The early CTA comes now. If this is gripping you, if you think she made a courageous choice, tap like and tell us where you're watching from in the comments." Mrs. Jenkins arrived with a pot of tea and a careful face. She moved through the townhouse as if remembering every scuffed corner. For a moment she paused, looking at Maya as if she could decide the girl's fate with a look. Then she wrapped a blanket around Maya's shoulders and poured a cup of the tea, as if it could melt what had happened. Marcus Reed arrived like a response code. He was broad-shouldered and pragmatic, the kind of man who had made a career building walls around other people's lives. He did not offer condolences. He stood, silent, while Daniel recounted in short, efficient sentences what he'd been told. When Daniel reached the part about Brandon, Marcus's jaw tightened in a way that said he had been expecting deception. In another life, he might have been a disappointed gambler. "Call Detective Pierce," Marcus said at last. Daniel had already done it. Pierce answered on the 3rd ring. His voice was not friendly. He had been to enough scenes to know how often troubled people made trouble worse for themselves. "Mr. Whitmore," Pierce said, "if this is a prank—" "It's not," Daniel interrupted. "I have a woman here. She overheard a plan. She's willing to testify. We need to put eyes on the apartment and trace a few leads." Pierce's line went quiet. The detective was the kind of voice you trusted with little things and feared with big ones. "I'll assign someone to the Queen's address," he said. "But if your client is credible, we have to do this through channels. No vigilante moves." Daniel agreed. He knew the difference between control and arrogance. His decision to ask the police to get involved did not come from weakness, but from an understanding of leverage. To force a criminal to act, you had to be the one to offer the terms under which they could be contained. If they had to play at a negotiation, let it happen under light. They arranged for Maya to be looked at by Dr. Feldman, a physician on the Foundation's list. No official interrogation yet, just a medical check for bruises and a note an officer could use if needed. Daniel watched her with the same patience he would watch a complicated investment. He did not ask her to explain every tiny inconsistency. He catalogued what she offered and allowed it to stand. "Do you know Victor Hale's people by sight?" Marcus asked, quiet. Maya named a driver she had seen once. She described a face-blind crew, men who did their work in gloves and masks, and who would not meet the eyes of a woman in a way that made them recognizable. She told them about a van that had idled outside once. the smell of diesel and something chemical that made her think of old rubber. Marcus did not prattle about tactics. He packed the information into a file in his mind. "We'll pull street cams," he said. "Start with that address. Cross-reference the plates. We find the driver, we find the van." Daniel did not want them to act. He wanted the police to act. But he also knew how fragile the timeline was. Hale's people had been thinking in transactions. Once they realized the leverage was compromised, they could accelerate. He began to assemble names. Richard Nolan at the Foundation, a trustee who had access to guest lists and delivery schedules. Nolan had been accommodating in the past. He had smiles that smoothed problems rather than solving them. Someone like Nolan could get a van onto the loading dock without a second look. "He could be the link," Daniel said. "If someone at the Foundation is being paid to mark the times, we'd find it in the roster or the logs." They watched footage of Maya leaving the Queen's apartment, grainy subway cameras trimming her like a witness. She watched herself in loops and flinched. The footage did not lie. It simply offered a record that could be argued over or used. Marcus synchronized feeds across the hours she had described, building a loose net of observation. It was a montage of anonymity. Faces that blurred at the edges, license plates half-lit, a van that was a rectangle of suspicion until a plate glowed, and then it was just a number. They found one frame that mattered, a delivery van backing into a loading bay behind a beige warehouse. The plate matched a shell company that showed up in minor filings tied to a chain of businesses no one wanted to ask about. Marcus made the calls that were necessary without telling Maya the detail of each step. He spoke in a voice that conveyed work, not panic. Meanwhile, in a small, dim room with a hospital lamp and a stack of paper cups, Dr. Feldman examined Maya. He was gentle. He found a bruise under one cheekbone, a swollen knuckle, a cut on the lip that would scar but not define her. He wrote a note that would stand up in an interview if it came to that. His pen strokes made the trauma legible in a language the criminals could not buy. "Did they touch you?" he asked in a voice that was only the voice of a doctor. "No," she said. "They just threatened. Made it clear that I would be replaced in the calculation." He nodded, as if he understood the human calculus of such moments. He did not press for detail. The pain of asking sometimes outweighed the benefit. Daniel let her sleep on a chaise under a wool blanket that smelled of his house and citrus. He sat at his desk and rearranged the chessboard of names. He called Richard Nolan himself. Nolan's voice slid smooth across the line like someone taught to make everything fine. He asked careful questions about the Foundation's schedule, mentioned a gala that was weeks away, opined on security with the blanditude of a man who had never sweated for his seat. Daniel cut to the point without theatricality. "Has anyone on your staff ever booked an unlogged delivery on a Thursday night?" Daniel asked. There was a pause that felt like a small tidal shift. Nolan's answers were practiced. "Not in months," he said. "If there's a concern, you tell my office. We pride ourselves on transparency." It was the sort of answer Marcus had catalogued before Marcus had even heard it. There was a comfort in Nolan's politeness that sat like a coin in the mouth of a river. You could taste the metal but not the current. Daniel made a note and watched Nolan for a reaction that never arrived. They convened a makeshift council in the parlor. Marcus at one end, Daniel opposite, Detective Pierce over the phone like a gravity well. Maya listened. Her voice was small, but when she spoke, there was clarity. Daniel's plan began to take shape around the contours she'd provided. "We can hide you," Marcus said, "relocate you, change your name, get you testified, run this through the courts. But if Victor Hale loses face, if they don't get the payoff, they escalate." "Escalate how?" Maya whispered, afraid of the answer. The word felt like weather that would not be kind. Pierce had been listening. "They lash out," he said. "They send signals, not always to the person who told, but to the community. We can't promise no retaliation. We can promise response. Daniel looked at Maya in a way that was not patronizing. He tried to measure the moral geometry of asking her to risk more. "You told me because you didn't want them to make you a commodity," he said. "But there are ways to stop them without letting them vanish. We can use light on them. We can force them to act under surveillance." Marcus's hands folded together. "We set a trap," he said, "but it's police-led. We give them a chance to make an arrest." Maya thought of her father's lined face at the kitchen table, his hands that had once taught her to fix a loose window latch. She thought of her brother, of the small, bitter smile he'd used when he mentioned a man named Hale like a solution. She thought of the debt number they'd spoken of, 420,000, how a figure could be used as weather to bury what love might have been. She had the sensation of being both small and the only fulcrum in a room that could tip an entire plan. "Do I have to go back?" she asked. The words were tiny and dangerous. "No," Marcus said immediately. "No, you don't." Daniel's gaze did not leave her. "We can't promise safety," he said. "We can promise we won't let them use you." The decision that would be the middle of everything came after they had stacked the names and the feeds, and the warmth wore off the tea. Daniel stood and walked to the window that looked down on the street, watching the light smear at the edge of a snowbank. He spoke in a voice that belonged to someone who had spent his life choosing what battles to fight. "I will not hide," he said. "I'll make myself visible." There was a silence like glass between them. Maya's eyes found his with a new note, something like fear and something like stubborn relief. To put a target on himself to draw the predators into a place where they could be seen and handled was not pure altruism. It was strategy. It fit him the way a well-tailored coat fit a man who could afford it. "Why?" Marcus asked. "You could stay in the house. We could close the doors." Daniel's shoulders were steady. "Because this is not only about my name. If I disappear, they will know where the weakness is. If I stay and make clear I am under watch, then anyone who moves is playing under camera. We'll force them to reveal themselves." Detective Pierce on the line asked the right question. "Are you prepared to be bait? Are you prepared to be in the line of fire, Mr. Whitmore?" Daniel's answer was a person folding himself into a shape he had practiced for years. "Yes," he said, "but not alone." They turned the evening into a calculus. Marcus tightened the roster of watchmen to include 2 off-duty NYPD officers on discreet detail and a surveillance van across the street that would look like a television crew. Mrs. Jenkins planned contingencies in the way someone who maintained the same silver spoons for decades plans for theft, methodically, almost affectionately. "Doctor." Feldman's note would go to Pierce. Nolan was still on the list. They had not yet put him in a corner, but they had him shaded in the margins. Maya watched them plan and felt both incapable and vital. She had been the single spark that ignited the operation. The shocking truth she had revealed, her own family's willingness to trade her for a number, now anchored the entire night's strategy. She had come with nothing but a name and an accusation. They had taken it and shaped it into defense. There were moments when she wanted to ask Daniel why he had listened so calmly. He told her once, in a softer tone, that his life had trained him to expect people to be complicated. "People do bad things for reasons that make sense to them," he said. "That doesn't make it right." "Why help me?" she asked in the dark when the tea had cooled. "You don't owe me anything." He did not answer in the way she expected. He shaped a sentence as one who arranges furniture, practical, tidy. "I can't buy everyone's peace," he said, "but I can keep someone from being sold." Outside, a van idled at the corner. It hummed a low, patient sound that made the hairs on her arm rise. Marcus strained against every muscle to keep his face neutral. Detective Pierce obtained warrants by the hour that moved like glaciers. Nolan answered calls on the foundation line in the way of someone who never imagined the necessity for fear. Maya slept with a scarf over her mouth to keep from waking with the taste of iron. Dreams were thin and persistent. Her father signing something, her brother counting money, hands passing an envelope like illicit weather. She woke when Marcus's knock sounded at 3. The surveillance team had found a lead, a plate that matched one of the shells. It was the kind of progress that did not feel like relief. It felt like the sound of a thread being pulled. "We have a traced plate," Marcus said. "It belongs to a company that lists a warehouse in Red Hook. The van's movements line up. We have cameras on the route." Daniel's face was carved into concentration. He moved like a man who had rehearsed an answer 1,000 times. The answer to escalation, the answer to taking a risk so others could be safe. There was no theatrical chest-beating or invulnerability. There was only the smell of citrus and the precision of someone calling in favors. "Pierce wants to wait until there's a clear act," Marcus said. "If we move too fast, they scatter. If we wait, they accelerate. It is a chess game." Maya's hands were clenched under the blanket. "What if they come for me?" she asked. "What if they come for him?" Daniel's mouth was a straight line. "Then we make sure they do it in public." "Public?" Her voice broke on the word, as if it were a thin rope. "In a way, it will limit them," Marcus said. "They like the dark. They like private exchanges. Put them in the light, and they have to expose themselves." The plan folded inward like a bloom late in winter. They would not let the criminals move in shadow. They would place light where shadows had been expected. They would force action under watchful eyes, then let the police do their work. They had a week of preparation stretched into an evening. They mapped out staffing. They placed cameras. They rehearsed exits. Richard Nolan's habit of smoothing problems had not been enough to prevent the Foundation's concrete ramp being surveilled. Staffers who had never before been asked a pointed question found themselves in a room with Marcus and explained little things. Delivery windows, a man who often signed in for deliveries without a badge. Each small confession was a gear in a machine that turned toward exposure. Maya sat through it and felt the muscles around her ribs unwind in tiny measures. There was, she knew, no guarantee. People who moved in the ways Hale's people did had layers. Still, she had lit the match. What no one could take away from her was the fact of that truth. She had refused to be silent. In the private space between decisions, Daniel asked her a question that landed like a cold stone. "If this forces them to run," he said quietly, "are you ready for the consequences of that being your decision?" Maya looked at him like someone looking for purchase on a cliff. "Are you?" she shot back. The question came sharper than she'd intended, but there was honesty inside it. She had chosen to speak, but there was more than herself at stake. Daniel did not flinch. "Yes," he said. "If it prevents them trading a human life for a ledger entry, then yes." The room exhaled as if on cue. The stakes were set. The net was ready. The job of watching and waiting began to feel like its own art form, tedious and necessary. They moved toward a point of no return, with the slow, granular aggression of people who knew how to make time an ally. Marcus checked the feeds one last time before the sun touched the edge of the city. Detective Pierce instructed his officers to prepare for the moment they would most likely need to step in. Daniel coordinated with the Foundation's event staff to lean into visible security rather than secrecy. Maya's name had become a lever that could alter how the city saw a plan that had been trying to hide. The thought of her brother and father being comfortable in their choices felt suddenly obscene. That afternoon, they found what they had feared, a woman who had driven a van once and stopped at a diner that would not remember faces. She was small in the surveillance clip, smoking a cigarette, a glove half removed. Her name was a piece of paper Marcus filed away. The driver was a man who had been seen too often around the boroughs. Layer by layer, the network that had been planning to sell a life began to show its seams. Daniel called Nolan again. This time, Nolan's voice carried a thinness that had not been present before. "We've had deliveries," he said. "A courier with a temp badge. We had a scheduling glitch." "Who authorized it?" Daniel asked. Nolan hesitated. "I did. There was a shipment of textiles. Someone from the off-site warehouse signed in late." Marcus's silence was heavy. It was the kind of pause that counted more than an accusation. The web was narrowing. "They gave their orders with the care of people who knew violence could be a blunt instrument when wielded without thought. They did not promise safety. They promised vigilance." Maya, in the middle of it all, felt her heart alternately lift and sink. Each new piece that fell into place could be a salvation or the prelude to something worse. As the sun sank, painting the city in the color of old cameras, Daniel changed his public schedule. He announced an appearance at a foundation meeting, a small, curated engagement designed to draw attention. The event would be obvious, lit, and thoroughly documented. The idea, rational in a way that matched his personality, was to make it impossible for people to move in the shadows. If Hale's men wanted their leverage, they'd have to do it where everyone could see. They prepared the Foundation's staff to act surprised but calm. They briefed the media in a way that made their presence a feature rather than a vulnerability. They arranged for additional officers to stand by. Marcus placed men at corners, jogging paths, anywhere a van might tuck itself and unload the night. Maya watched the pieces fall into place, with the same mixture of dread and relief a person felt while watching a storm approach. The family that had tried to sell her had no idea she had already left. They were, in many ways, still counting their coins. Night came soft and fast, and with it a realization that at some point you stop rehearsing and begin to hope. They were ready on paper. They were ready by the glow of monitors and the stoic watch of men and women who had sworn to keep others safe. But readiness in a room does not equate to control on a stoop. If Hale wanted to declare war, he could escalate the way a man like him always had, through means that did not always stop at the law. Before the event, Maya asked Daniel in the stairwell, her voice a thin filament, "If this goes wrong, if they hurt someone, will it be because I told you?" Daniel did not blink. He regarded her as if measuring the weight of the world on the tip of a scale. "You told the truth," he said. "If anything goes wrong, it will be because someone counted on silence. You chose otherwise." They left the townhouse together for the event, Marcus watching their backs like the weather. Cameras followed them from a distance, a satellite maze of lenses that had become their immediate guardians. The city watched with its habitual ambivalence. People went to dinner and missed the arcane drama playing on one block. Others, in the small world of social feeds, turned the evening into a spectacle and missed the danger in the corners. Maya found herself swallowed by the crowd of the Foundation's guests, wrapped in a shawl borrowed from Mrs. Jenkins. Her braids were tucked beneath a hat. She felt like a coin turned on its edge. She had started the night as a maid, a position that ordered her body to move behind others' lives. Now the whole room was a set, and she a small actor called to speak the truth. But this was where the story reached a pivot that would demand more than courage from anyone. The van that had been traced through feeds and plates and a woman in a diner had not stopped moving. A driver who had been marked by surveillance had slipped a pattern and found a way to move where it would be less obvious. Marcus noticed first. A camera in the alley caught the van turning where it should not. The driver was a new face in an old role, someone with nerves braided by practice. Marcus's voice on the earpiece was a clipped instrument. "Eyes on the van," he said. "Pierce, you there?" Pierce's voice answered with an economy of syllables that meant the gears were turning. "We're on it." Daniel hardened like a man bracing for weather. He could feel the possibility of violence, like the static charge before a thunderclap. He had chosen to be visible. Now visibility meant being bait. He thought of his name used as currency. He thought of the ledger that had almost traded a human life. He thought of Maya, shivering under her borrowed shawl. Everything tightened around a hinge. The plan folded toward an action that would either expose the people who trafficked in fear or inflame them. Marcus adjusted his men. Pierce directed officers toward the alley with a steady voice. Nolan, on some plane they could not reach, said nothing that mattered. Maya's breath hitched. She pressed her palm to her chest, as if feeling for a heartbeat she feared she might lose. Daniel moved through the crowd like a man walking into a negotiation whose terms he had set. He was not reckless. He was focused. When the van pulled up, the hush that settled felt like a held note before a chord breaks. The driver killed the engine and sat in the dark, a silhouette against the streetlight. The men inside the van were not yet out. They were still wrapped in the false anonymity of a wound that had not yet been opened. Marcus waited for the signal. Pierce's men fanned silently like storm clouds. People in the foundation thought it was an arrival for another delivery. Maya's hands were cold, and she could not feel any certainty in them. She remembered a kitchen table where promises had been made and then traded like cards. She felt the truth she had uttered vibrate inside her like a bell. Up the block, somewhere else, a car idled, and a man listened. The house lights snapped from shadow to glare. The surveillance van's sensors picked up motion. Marcus stepped forward. Daniel's face remained a mask of control. Detective Pierce gave an order that sounded small and final over the radio. But the world is one misstep away from catastrophe. The driver in the van saw a chance and took it. The kind of human calculation that does not require much courage, only opportunism. He stepped out, head down, moving toward the loading dock as if he belonged. 2 men followed him, hands in pockets like men who wanted to seem harmless. Marcus's men moved like a single body, and Pierce's officers emerged at the same time. The van's doors opened. There was a scramble that was sudden and uneven. The police moved in quick and efficient waves. For a moment the night was a blur of action, cameras zooming, a man shouting, clips of uniforms and a van door slamming. 3 men were on the ground, cuffed, shouting and sputtering with the rawness of arrested momentum. The driver, a hand to his ear, sprinted. He was a shadow that slid between cars and then evaporated down a side street. The van's engine coughed and then died. Maya watched as men were dragged to the pavement. Her knees felt weak. She wanted to step into the circle forming around the van, to see with her own eyes the faces of those who had planned to buy a person. Daniel stood at the edge, his face pinched. He did not move toward the men in handcuffs. He observed. They had won a small victory. They had turned the van into evidence, and 3 arrests into a narrative, but the driver had escaped. He disappeared into the web of a city that loves to hide people without trying. Pierce's voice was tight. The detective knew that arrests could mean retribution as often as justice. "They'll report back," Pierce said, blunt and practical. "Hale will escalate." Hale! The name loomed over the block like a promise. Victor Hale was not a man who played small games. Hale was a man whose business was fear, who monetized leverage like a broker with low morals and high appetite. That the driver had escaped meant someone on the other end could still move. Maya felt the truth return to her like a physical wound. Her family had intended to sell her. The 3 cuffed men were a small confetti of exposure. But 1 man running meant the operation still breathed. The night that began with a whisper at a door had not yet closed. Daniel turned to her, voice even but with an edge she had not heard before. "You were the fulcrum," he said. "You moved us. That was right." She looked at him. The gratitude she felt was complicated by fear. "But it's not over," Marcus added. The line between the 2 men was a long one. Marcus pragmatic, Daniel composed. Hale doesn't fold when set back. He adapts. Maya understood that the world had shifted. She had not simply told a billionaire a secret. She had unlatched a mechanism that could make them all unsafe. Her father and brother slept that night not knowing their daughter's accusation had brought a van to a halt in front of a townhouse. They had done what they could in that moment. Arrests, footage, statements. Pierce filed him in a way that would be legible to any desk sergeant who had to wrestle with the city's peculiar arithmetic of crime. They had partial success, a net with holes. In the quiet that followed those minutes, while the police processed their suspects and the Foundation came down from its small adrenaline, a different kind of silence settled. It was the kind that comes after a high tide, when the water pulls back and reveals what it has taken. Daniel escorted Maya back to the townhouse. Marcus stayed to talk to Pierce. Mrs. Jenkins had set fresh tea. Maya removed her hat with trembling hands and sat by the window, watching the street be righted by uniforms and lights. "You thought they'd use my name," Daniel said softly, "because they needed something loud to make it hurt. They used it to mask something that was already ugly." Maya thought of the kitchen where Brandon had counted out an amount, and her father had nodded, like a man ratifying his own shame. She thought of the number again, and felt it as a thing that could be thrown away. "What they wanted was to make me a reason," she said. "Exactly," Daniel agreed. "Not only that, but to make a story people would accept. A bargain in public lives by silence." Her family had relied on silence, their own and the city's. They had assumed they could auction off a life without anyone noticing. That assumption had been their arrogance. "You'll need to testify," Pierce said later when he sat at Daniel's table with a folder. His face was less judge than machine. "Statements, a hearing. You'll have protection if you cooperate. We can put you into a program." Maya looked at the detective. "My family. There'll be charges if the evidence supports it," Pierce said. He did not speak of the moral havoc of a family that would sell a child. He spoke of evidence, records, and the slow engine of the law. "We can protect you." Protection was a ledger of its own. The law could move in line and shape, but it could not always heal. Maya imagined a life behind a new name and wondered if names are ever properly changed. She imagined Brandon in court, and her father sitting in a chair too small for his shame. Daniel watched her process all of it. "We didn't finish it tonight," he said. 3 arrests are not the whole of Victor Hale." "No," Marcus said when he returned. He had a file with him and a look that said he had the unpleasant taste of a long fight in his mouth. "He won't be stopped by a single night's arrests. But tonight, we forced something. We made him act where he could be seen. That changes the nature of his business." Maya wanted to ask whether the business would shrink or whether it would go deeper underground. She wanted to ask if telling had been a net or a spear. Only Daniel answered in a way that felt like a tether to sanity. "A single person telling the truth can change what happens next," he said. "But systems don't end because someone speaks. They adapt." The words were not a rebuke. They were a fact. She felt simultaneously proud and terrified. They settled into that uneasy peace. Marcus organized a watch that would take shifts. Detective Pierce would file what he could. Mrs. Jenkins would make sure Maya ate and did not stare at the walls too long. Daniel offered her a place to stay. It was not a gesture of pity, but of practical shelter. "You don't have to decide now," Daniel said. Maya looked at him. Outside, the city hummed. The arrest had been a thread pulled. Whether it would unravel an entire net or only make it stronger remained a question none of them could answer. She thought of her father and of Brandon's cheap smile. She thought of Victor Hale as a man who made a market of people's desperation. She thought of the number again, and of the ledger that had tried to make her a commodity. "I told you the truth," she said finally. "I told you the truth," she said finally. Daniel watched the words land like a small, precise blow. He had expected lies, evasions, the half-truths people told themselves to stay sane. He had not expected confession, the blunt, terrible honesty of a daughter naming her kin as the architects of her sale. For a minute he only looked at her, as if, by studying the tremor in her voice, he could measure how much of the world had altered in that single admission. Outside, the city exhaled steam into the night. Inside, the townhouse kept its own temperatures, the citrus warmth of the parlor, the cool minimalism of Daniel's study, the hush that followed a fact that did not fit into ordinary charts. Marcus closed the file he had been turning over and set it on the coffee table like a small, heavy fact. "Thank you for telling us," Daniel said quietly. He folded his hands, the way a man folded plans he intended to keep. "There are things we will have to run through the proper channels now. Detective Pierce will need a formal statement." Maya felt a pressure ease in her chest at the word proper. The law could be mechanical, slow, and imperfect. It was also the one predictable instrument left in a life otherwise traded in impulse and shame. She nodded. The nod was thin, almost mechanical, but it was acknowledgement. She had done the thing she had feared most, that which could not be undone. Detective Pierce came the next morning with a folder and a face that had long ago made a truce with bad news. He sat across from Maya and asked questions in the manner of someone attempting to map a landscape without disturbing its evidence. He asked for dates, for names, for small gestures that could become proof. A voicemail, a transfer, a slip of paper with an address. Each answer Maya gave was a notch in the rails that would carry the case forward. "They're going to want corroboration," Pierce said. "We can get warrants, we can go after financials, but it'll take patience, and it will take you." There was no heroism in his tone. There was only process, and the brittle way it held promises. Maya understood. She had no illusions that this would straighten the crooked spines of her family's choices. But there was a new word now, threaded through the conversation: consequence. Daniel watched as she answered, and as Pierce's expression shifted in the subtle way experienced people showed when a case altered their expectations. Marcus hovered by the doorway, a presence that implied readiness rather than menace. When Pierce left, he did so with instructions: stay under protection, provide everything, don't make contact with the accused without an officer present. The nights that followed were uneven. Some where she slept easily in the layers of Daniel's house, and some where a small sound would jolt her to the ceiling. Marcus set up rotations. Officers took watch, not so much conciliation as a quiet guarantee that the city would not pretend the problem did not exist. Mrs. Jenkins made the house into a careful schedule of meals and decency. Daniel answered calls, met with lawyers, and sat with Maya in the dark with a silence that made room for things too tender to name. They began to build the chain that could bring culpability into court. Phone records, delivery logs, the grain of surveillance footage. They collected what could be collected without tearing the fabric of the city apart. Richard Nolan, the boardman with a smile that had once smoothed problems, found his name shadowed in a way that made him thin and reactive. Questions to the Foundation's ledger revealed irregular entries and odd late-night signings. It was enough to make him defensive and to make Marcus's instincts sharpen. "He's not the sort to soil himself if he can avoid it," Marcus said one evening, tapping a page, "but he is the sort to let someone else get dirty." Daniel's line to Nolan went through with a tone that did not require victory to be polite. Nolan answered in that practiced calm. The questions were careful. Nolan's answers, more so. They did not break him on the spot. He had lived long enough in corridors of influence to know when to play insouciant. Yet under the outside of smoothness, there were flinches, missed pauses, small sounds that were a man's guilt surfacing. With each disclosure, the picture of a small conspiracy assembled itself, a network of convenience, favors traded for cash, moments bought and washed. It was not a tidy criminal enterprise with neat ledgers and meeting rooms. It was uglier in its familiarity, men making deals in kitchens over ruined coffee, A father counting the price of a child's silence as if counting pills. That was the part that hit hardest, the ordinariness of the betrayal. Maya's father and Brandon were not yet in custody. They might be, they might not. Marcus had a file thick with phone calls and messages, but truth and proof were not always the same thing. Still, the law moved. Warrants were drawn. An officer in plain clothes went to the Queen's apartment with the kind of careful formality that made a woman like Mrs. Jenkins hold her breath. The door opened, and a man greeted them with a surprised blankness that masked something like an old habit, habitual avoidance. They found a ledger in a drawer, scrawled amounts, phone numbers. They found a receipt for a cash withdrawal on a date that matched one of the entries. The evidence was not cinematic, it was paper, it was numbers, it was the small, mortal proof of something monstrous. Brandon's surprise gave way to denial, and then to a brittle acceptance when the officers spoke of statements and the possibility of charges. His face paled in a way Maya recognized from childhood tantrums. Anger diluted into shame. Her father, sitting on the edge of his bedcloth with his hands folded, looked smaller than she had ever seen him. The man who had taught her to patch a window was reduced to a silhouette of mistake. He did not speak much. He answered with short nods and whispers. When officers took him in for questioning, his eyes found Maya for a moment across the room. There was a look that carried the gravity of debt and the peculiar, shameful bargaining people believe can save them. There was no dramatic courtroom confession that night. There were only statements and the click of forms being signed. The police took what they could. Brandon was detained for questioning. Her father was brought in for a statement. The arrests, when they came, were not a ceremonial unmasking. They were a collection of human failures presented under fluorescent lights and bureaucratic efficiency. Hale's reaction, however, was not the predictable fury of a crime boss in a movie. He showed a different economy, one that understood fear and the power of symbols. The three men from the van were held, processed, and blamed one another like small fish flapping in a bucket. Their mouths moved with the practiced logic of men paid to deny. The driver, the one who had escaped, made a shadow of himself in the city's back alleys. If Hale had intended to turn the van into a decisive hammer, he had misread the room. The net had teeth. Then Hale made his own choice. He came himself. The message arrived at dusk. A photograph sent to an intermediary, a carpentry shop owner who had once been quietly indebted to Hale's network. A plain image of a man stepping off a train with a coat, a hat, and a face like a closed ledger. He moved with the particular ease of someone who had been in rooms where things were decided. He did not come with fury that needed proving. He came with a reputation that needed to be enforced. "I don't think he's coming here to bargain," Marcus told Daniel quietly, watching through a window the way a man watched a mouth he could not quite trust. Hale arrived on foot, not by car. He walked the long way because he wanted to be seen, because the very act of moving through a city in broad daylight was a statement. He reached the stoop of Daniel's townhouse with the casual confidence of a man who presumed his influence traveled farther than any single arrest could reach. Men followed him at a distance, body men at most, and he had the look of someone who managed economies of fear rather than fighting with them. The stoop was lit by formal light. It was public. It was whatever Hale wanted to show to the city. He was brazen enough to stand where witnesses could find them. There was a tension in that decision. He wanted spectacle. He wanted to force a surrender of dignity from Daniel by making the confrontation public. He intended to say that men could be bartered and that reputations could be bought back. He said nothing when Marcus opened the door for him. He inclined his head in a mock courtesy and let the air in the parlor do its quiet work. Daniel met him with the same tacit control he had shown all along. Hair combed, coat buttoned, the set of a man who preferred chess to brawling. Mrs. Jenkins watched from the threshold, with hands clenched so slightly the fabric near her knuckles whitened. Victor Hale spoke first with an economy of words. He had an old man's mouth and a younger man's wire for danger. "You're making a mistake," he said, not unkindly. "This is business that ought to be kept tidy." Daniel's reply was a contained thing. He named no threats. He offered no apologies. "This is a house where a woman came with the truth," he said. "If your business requires people to be sold, then it is not business at all." Hale smiled. It was a smile that admitted to no human error. It was a broker's smile. "You think this is about commerce?" he asked. "You think I'd stoop to buy a girl? No, Mr. Whitmore. I deal in leverage. I deal in leverage for people who ask me to move mountains." Maya felt something like a rope tightening around her chest. She watched Hale with a mix of revulsion and pity. There was a cold that radiated from him that had nothing to do with weather. "You were supposed to be anonymous," he said, turning slightly as if to a shadow that might have been an imagined accomplice. "You caught a stray. Sometimes strays are useful. Sometimes they're a nuisance." "Is that what you told Brandon?" Maya asked before she could stop herself. Her voice shook, but the words had a simple truth that needed to be said aloud. Hale looked at her like a man evaluating a commodity's promise. "Your family made a choice," he said blandly. "They had a problem, and I offered a solution." The simplicity of the sentence made a rumble in the parlor like a distant thunder. The horror of it, a problem solved by a human life, hit the room as if a window had been slammed. Maya's face felt thin with the wind of it. Daniel did not flinch. He had no need to. "You were offered money," he said. "You know the rest. This doesn't make it less ugly." Hale shrugged as if ugliness were a costume he had been asked to wear. "We all have transactions," he said. "You have your philanthropy. I have my services. I keep things tidy. No one asked for a moral lecture." Marcus stepped forward just enough to make the space between the men measured by muscle and preparation. "This is not a negotiation about ethics," he said. "It's about criminal activity. Detective Pierce and his team are present. Make any false move, and you'll see what happens when people who trade in fear are brought into the light." The frown Hale wore for a brief instant widened into something feral. He had not expected, and perhaps not feared, this kind of coordinated legal pressure. The men who followed him shifted, the small muscles in their shoulders micro-contracting like a reflex. Hale settled instead into cruelty's more civilized cousin, charm. "You think law will hold up against need," he said softly. "You think an undercooked conscience will cure hunger. People like me don't disappear because we get arrested. We get smarter." He stepped back, as if to say the conversation had concluded. For a moment the room hung between two economies, the legal, which required proof and process, and Hale's, which traded in threats and whispered payments. Daniel's response was a simple, clear refusal to barter the moment into a spectacle. "You're under arrest, Victor Hale," Detective Pierce said from the doorway, his voice carrying a weight like a gavel. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, human trafficking, and several related charges. Anything you say can be used against you." For a beat, Hale's eyes scanned the room like a man looking at a balance sheet and realizing a miscalculation. He did not run. He did not lash out. He did not make the operatic display some men in his position made to show defiance. Instead, he allowed himself to be led by two officers whose hands were on his arms with a firm, mechanical courtesy. As they led him past the parlor, he leaned toward Maya and said, in a tone that felt like a whisper in a cathedral, "You should be careful what truths you sell in the world. Not all buyers are eager to pay their debts." They walked him down the steps with the measured confidence of an industry that had been interrupted. Cameras flashed. Neighbors peered from behind curtains and tried to pass a drama stitched into the night. The arrest was quick, professional, and drained of the expected violence by its own efficiency. When Hale passed out of sight into the back of a squad car, he turned his head and for a moment looked directly at Daniel. "You can stop one man," he said gently, "but you can't stop what his absence will prompt. Try to remember that." Pierce let the sentence hang a moment longer than necessary and then resumed the small, necessary work of a detective tallying the first victory. "We get statements," he said. "We get evidence. We pursue. He won't be the last name on our list, but it's a start." In the aftermath, the sensation in the house was like the slow settling after a storm. People moved through rooms in quieter patterns. Marcus double-checked the officers' rotations as if the act of counting made the future more terminable. Mrs. Jenkins served tea with steady hands and a face that had been accustomed to trying to smooth edges. "Did you think he'd show?" Maya asked Daniel after the officers left. Daniel looked at her for a long second, the kind of look that measured not just the event, but the man in the event. "He wanted to make a point," he said. "He thinks spectacle matters. He misread us. He thought he could intimidate with presence." "And now?" she asked. "Now he is in custody," Daniel said. "But you heard him. He said his world will continue. He's not a head you cut off to end an empire. He is a symptom." It was an accurate appraisal. Hale's arrest, while satisfying in the immediate sense, did not undo the erosion that systems of exploitation left in their wake. People like Hale operated in layers. They had facilitators and small-town enforcers and men who kept ledgers with names that matched tender faces. An arrest closed a door, but did not necessarily seal the passage beneath the building. Detective Pierce, methodical as ever, called for statements, followed up on witnesses, and set the wheels in motion that would require months of subpoenas, depositions, and cross-examinations. The Foundation's board convened emergency meetings. Richard Nolan was put on administrative leave while auditors combed records for anomalies. Maya watched the machinery of accountability grind into motion. It was not satisfying in a cinematic way. There were bureaucratic detours and moments of legalistic tedium that made her eyes glaze with exhaustion. She signed forms and listened to pieces of her life being translated into testimony. Some nights she would wake with the taste of iron in her mouth and the image of her father's hands counting money, as if the smallest acts of commerce had become a form of violence. Then one evening, Daniel sat with her on the back porch of the townhouse, the city unfolding beyond the hedge, like a restless sea. Snow had begun to fall again, fine and steady, making the world muffled and honest. "You have options," he told her. "We can put you in a program. We can move you. You can testify. You can choose a life away from all of it." She looked at him, and then at the way his hands folded around a cup. "Is this about me, or the story that needs telling?" she asked. "It is both," he answered. "You didn't just reveal something to me. You exposed a truth that affected many lives. But I also don't want your life to be reduced to that single night." The fragility in that sentence was precisely the kind of space she had been afraid of. She wanted to be more than the woman who had startled a billionaire awake at his door. She wanted to reclaim her life from the ledger of shame her family had tried to write. "You've done enough," she said. It was not a plea for pity, it was an assertion of agency. "I want to be more than a witness in someone else's drama." Daniel nodded. "You already are." There was a small, careful offer he made then, one that Daniel presented as easily as a man would extend a hand across a table. "If you want it, you can stay here for as long as you need. We can work with the department and the legal team to see your options. No charity, no exhibition, a place to be safe." It was not charity. It was shelter with conditions of respect. Maya felt the edges of something like relief. She had not wanted to be returned to a life that had arranged her sale as casually as one might sell a car. She had wanted to make a choice that did not start with her being catalogued as a price. Days stacked. Weeks stacked. Testimonies were given. The legal work was exhausting. Depositions that excavated lies, hearings that tested the resolve of witnesses. The Foundation reacted with the bureaucratic swiftness of institutions that had reputations to protect. Nolan was questioned, his veneer of civility cracking into anger. He was not arrested immediately. The law required proof. Yet the stain lapped at his reputation. Flags were raised. The board that had once smiled at him now kept a distance. Brandon and their father were compelled to speak to officers. Brandon's answers were at first denial, and then, when the weight of paper proofs made illusions impossible, a kind of collapsing. Maya watched him in court with a face that was all the things older siblings had taught her not to show: pity and a cold sense of finality. Their father, when he came to say that he had been wrong and that he had been lost and that he had wanted to fix things, his apologies were small epiphanies that did not erase the ledger. There were consequences in the quiet ways that mattered. The community knew. Whispers became knowledge, and knowledge became caution. Maya's relationship with her father and brother was irrevocably altered. It was not something that law alone could make whole. It would take time, and likely the work of separate healers. It would take more than police files. But in the immediate, something had shifted. The man who had once counted out a price for his daughter was now a man who sat in a bland room and tried to answer questions. The brother who had laughed about logistics now found himself under the scrutiny he had once applied like a glove. It was not justice in the grand sense, but it was a beginning. Months later, when the case against Hale moved from local to federal interest, when more pieces of the network were revealed through subpoenas and a few brave witnesses, the city murmured as if testing the sound of reform. There were prosecutors who began to press charges, and men who found themselves stripped of the anonymity that had served them. It was not a sweeping cure. It was a set of small, legal adjustments that would force the machinery of corruption to expose its parts. Through it all, Maya did not become a character in someone else's story. She accepted the offer to stay with Daniel for a while, refuge that came with boundaries and dignity. She worked at a community center part-time, a job that did not ask too much too soon. She met other people who had been hurt by the city's quiet economies and who did not see themselves as victims but as survivors. She took classes, small and disciplined. She learned how to keep her bank account and her documents in a way that no one could use to commodify her again. Marcus kept watch in the shadowy ways he was allowed to, a human presence that implied readiness but did not suffocate. Detective Pierce continued to shepherd the case through the legal thickets that followed a high-profile arrest. Daniel kept his life as it had been, his investments, his philanthropy, but something in him had shifted from the ostentation of wealth to a new, less flashy conviction that some public acts required private courage. On a cold afternoon, lit by low winter sun, as the city settled into a rhythm that made sense to people who lived by seasons, Daniel met Maya on the stoop and handed her a small cardboard envelope. Inside was a letter, formal, short, a statement from Pierce that she could provide to a protection program if she chose, paperwork that would begin to build a net of legal safety. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to," Daniel said. Maya took the envelope like someone accepting a small key. The action was simple but heavy. "I know," she replied, "but I also know I can't ignore what happened." She folded the paper and slipped it into her coat. The movement was both practical and symbolic, the acceptance of agency over victimhood. Months later, in a courtroom that smelled faintly of coffee and old wood, Hale stood at a defendant's table with a face that had lost some of its casual cruelty. The trial was ugly with human waiting, testimonies that required courage, cross-examinations that tisked at human failings, and the public's curiosity like a low-grade sea. Maya took the stand with Marcus and Daniel at the edges of her world like fixed stars. She described the kitchen, the numbers, the name of the man who had been offered currency for a daughter. She did it with the terse clarity of someone who had no appetite for embellishment. She did not perform. She simply reported truth after truth, and the courtroom listened. Hale's conviction was not immediate. Trials are not tidy. There were appeals and legal maneuvers, and the peculiar inertia of a justice system built to be cautious. Yet the case had exposed a network. Other indictments followed. The driver, the one who had first escaped, was arrested months later in a different city and pushed into a collaboration that helped prosecutors paint a fuller picture. Richard Nolan faced consequences inside the Foundation, as its board distanced itself, and accountants traced oddities that had long been buried by a culture of convenience. There were victories and there were losses. The criminal world adapted, as Victor Hale had predicted. Some operations sank back into the shadows, where they whispered and recalibrated. New men stepped up to the plate. The work of dismantling what had been a network of men preying on desperation was not a linear march toward justice, but a series of skirmishes and holdfasts, each small victory forcing a retreat or a new strategy. Maya's life became a testament to the fact that one person could shift the arc of events. The revelation she had dropped on Daniel's stoop did not fix every broken thing, did not immediately heal the wound in her family, and did not end the city's quiet markets. But it forced light into corners that had long been kept dim. It made people accountable. It made the men who trafficked in fear step into court. On an evening months after the arrest, Daniel walked Maya to the subway. The city had its usual hush, with vinyl bags rustling, a woman singing softly on a bus, the distant sound of deliveries. They paused on a corner where snow had been pushed into a curb and the light spread pale over their faces. "You changed what happened," Daniel said, "not the whole world. But that night, your truth stopped a terrible transaction. That mattered." Maya looked at him, as if measuring how much of him was truth and how much was care. "I told the truth," she said, "and it mattered. But it's not like everything has been fixed. People will still be hungry. People will still be tempted to find quick ways out of impossible debts." "No system disappears because one man is arrested," Daniel agreed. "But systems can be interrupted." "Interrupted," she repeated. The word was a small, careful hope. They stood and then hugged as strangers do when they want to give a private weight a public seal. Daniel let go first. He watched her descend into the subway, watched the back of her head as she blended into the city's moving crowd. He knew what Hale had meant when he warned of continued war. Power structures had long memories. Yet what he also knew, in the private logic that had led him to be visible that night, was that people could choose to be part of the light. In the weeks that followed, the Foundation published reforms. Nolan left under unclear terms and whispers that fed the feeds and then moved on. Legal teams tightened processes. A small fund for people at risk of exploitation was created with Daniel's signatures attached. Small, concrete gestures that might keep one person from being once again reduced to exchange. Maya stayed close enough to the city to keep her life in reach, but far enough to feel the space for a new story. She tried to rebuild a relationship with her father that would not gloss over what he had done. He worked toward making restitution in ways that were not always enough and sometimes were clumsy, but there was a path now in front of him. One built from accountability, therapy, small acts of reparation. Brandon's future remained uncertain. So did the quiet lives of other men like him, tempted by the ledger and the quick fix. The last image the story left was not one of a neat ending. On a cold afternoon, Daniel stood with Marcus and Detective Pierce on the edge of a park where children made patterns in the snow. They watched a city that was both indifferent and stubbornly alive. The talk between them was practical, plans, contingencies, the way the law moved. They joked briefly to keep their voices from being all business. Then they stood in a short silence. "She changed tonight," Marcus said. His words were spare but meant. A single truth can alter the course of a night. "It did more than alter a night," Pierce added. It altered a chain of events that will take years to weigh out. Sometimes that's all you get. Daniel looked at the path that cut through the park, at people whose lives were unremarkable and miraculous in their persistence. He thought of the ledger that had tried to price a human life, and of the small, astonishing act of a maid who ran through snow to tell a billionaire the truth. He lifted his chin, as if making a small toast to a fact both fragile and fierce. One person saying the truth can change how the rest of us move, he said. But it doesn't end the world. It starts something. Maya, walking home from a volunteer shift, passed them. She did not look back long. She moved forward with a small, steady step, the sort of step that belongs to people who have survived and then decided to keep going. In the window of the townhouse, a final light went on, a tiny human signal that life continued in the wake of all that had happened. The men who had conspired, the family who had bartered, the billionaire who had been used as a name, all of them were part of a knot that had been loosened, but not entirely undone. The shocking truth she had revealed about family, about desperation, about how easily a life could be priced into a transaction, rippled out from a single midnight knock into a longer reckoning. It did not fix the city's inequities, nor erase the scars it left, but it did show something essential. When someone speaks the truth, even when it is small and expensive and terrifying, the arc of events bends. It bends enough for consequences to be set in motion, for accountability to begin, and for choices to be made differently. There was no tidy moral to tie up the city's messy business. There was instead a quieter conviction that echoed in the step of every person who decided to tell a truth no one else wanted to hear. The night the maid walked through snow to tell a billionaire what her family had done was the night one voice forced a system to answer. If this story moved you, if Maya's courage resonated, subscribe for more cinematic true crime style fiction and tell us in the comments, would you tell the truth at the risk of everything you knew?